This is the first of a series of lectures that will cover the history of the Christian Church from the beginning at Pentecost up to the current day and what has been taking place over those many centuries. If you're familiar with the history of mankind as described in the Old Testament, you remember that Adam and Eve had one rule to follow, and they failed to keep that. And with their decision to be their own gods, they lost the glory covering of God and were cast out of the Garden of Eden. Their descendants made the choice to move away from God. So Adam and Eve were forced out of the garden, and their children, one of them, made the choice to leave the land of Eden and move into the wild, untamed world. After many generations, Yahweh called Abraham out of the idolatry of Ur to a land of promise to him and his descendants. At this time, God promised Abram, to later be renamed Abraham, that through him and his descendants, the entire world would be blessed. In Genesis 18, verses 17 and 18, we read, "And the Almighty said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I intend to do, seeing that Abraham will certainly become a great and mighty nation, and that all the nations of the earth will be blessed in him." So after residing in the land of Canaan for some time among the pagan peoples who currently live there, because of a famine, they left and entered Egypt. After many generations, God raised up Moses to lead the people of Israel out of their slavery in Egypt, to wander in the desert for 40 years, and eventually re-enter the land promised to them so many years before. Because of their sin, that generation did not enter the promised land, but their children did, and were led by Joshua to slowly and eventually overthrow the many tribes, many peoples, and many cities that were there. Over time, the people of Israel were led by judges and then by kings, the first king being self-appointed and proved to be an absolute failure, a man by the name of Saul, who was eventually replaced by David, from whose line the Messiah would eventually come. The leadership of Israel was both good and bad, eventually splitting into two nations and going into slavery to the nations around them. After many centuries, the incarnation took place through the person of Mary, known as the Theotokos, bringing in at the exact right time the one who would restore the relationship between Yahweh and mankind. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, called his disciples, began his ministry, was betrayed by the Jews who saw him as a threat, was crucified, rose from the dead, and after 40 days of teaching his disciples, he gave this Holy Spirit to guide and fill the church to then ascend to the right hand of God the Father. An extremely important point to acknowledge here is that of Jesus' teaching. First, Jesus taught his disciples, and they took this teaching to the nations around them. Second, Jesus did not leave his people with nothing, but gave them the Holy Spirit to fill and guide the church, with the promise that the gates of hell would not prevail over the church. Third, with these 2 points in mind, the correct conclusion to draw is that there is one church, one faith, and one baptism, thus one people of God. The giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost is considered the birthday of the church. Fourth, Jesus limited his own ministry to only those who were considered Jews and the people of God. Fifth, when he completed his ministry, he passed on the instruction to take the gospel to the nations around the nation of Israel. This included all nations around the Mediterranean, the land of Africa, the land of India, Europe, and into what is now called Russia. As the apostles succeeded in bringing the gospel to these places, they saw incredible success as many, many peoples and nations embraced the good news of the gospel. With many churches being built and organized around the instruction given to them by the apostles, at this time there was one church, one faith, and one baptism, built upon the teaching given to the apostles by Jesus the Christ. We know from history at that time that gospels were written, epistles were written, copied and passed around from church to church all around the Mediterranean. But sadly, the practice of false gospels, false epistles, and errant teaching was also taking place, being sold off and communicated as writings of the apostles. This was a common practice at the time. writing a document in the spirit of an apostle, which we today would call plagiarism. At that time, they had no such concept. In order to form an accurate foundation for the Christian faith, the leaders of the church in the 4th century responded to these writings by asking the question, is what is written here what we have always believed and practiced? Also, sadly, there were some men within the church that began twisting the teaching that had been given to them in order to privately interpret the message according to their own opinions. So the church worked through all these many documents and asked that question, is what is written here in line with what we've always practiced and believed? In this next lecture, we'll go into those details and seek understanding of what was going on around the Mediterranean in terms of those who were calling themselves Christians, what they were doing, and how the church responded to those errors and to those deceptions.